We cross to my colleague Thulasizwe Simelane, who is at the Nasrec Expo Center. Now, this is the home of the G20 Leaders Summit. Good afternoon yet again, Thulasizwe. It's over to you.
Yeah, good afternoon, Fundo. It's the moment of truth for South Africa as the world leaders from the countries that make up the G20, as well as countries that are actually invited, that are not necessarily part of the G20, are arriving thick and fast. Lots of landings at OR Tambo International Airport, as well as the Air Force Base Waterkloof. This is SABC News. We're coming to you live from Nasrec Expo Center, where the Leaders Summit will be taking place over the next 2 days. We are the host broadcaster of G20 South Africa 2025, and in that vein then we are rolling out the full infrastructure, and we're basically pulling all stops to ensure that we bring you insightful coverage, as well as informed coverage from the various experts that we'll be talking to over the next few days. And one of those, Dr. Ronesh Dhawraj, who is the SABC News research editor. Good afternoon and welcome, Ronesh. It's been a while. I haven't seen you.
It has been very, very long, Thulasizwe. Always good to be with you.
It's a major moment for South Africa. So South Africa, on the broad level, the theme is solidarity, equality, sustainability. But in pursuing that, there are 15 working groups in the Sherpa track that South Africa has decided that if we move these items, they will help us achieve those 3 goals that we have set. Let's talk about those agenda items. Talk to me about debt sustainability. It's very important, isn't it, if this G20 is to deliver not only for the global south, but for the African continent and developing nations in general.
No, absolutely, Thulasizwe. And I think the importance of this G20 being held for the first time on the African continent, for the first time in South Africa, it cannot be overemphasized, the symbolism of this. And I think President Cyril Ramaphosa, South African president, was very clear, when we took over the presidency last year, November, that Africa will be at the center and the global south will also be the main focus of our presidency, which ends on the 30th of November. When it comes to African debt, Africa is always disadvantaged in terms of bond yields, in terms of borrowing from Western-led countries. If you're talking about Western-led institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and then we also can throw in the WTO, the World Trade Organization. But then you get a forum such as the G20. You get forums like the G7. Then it was, it kind of expanded to the G20 eventually. These organizations are kind of challenging that narrative now. The focus now has moved to the global south firstly, and it has moved to the developing world. And I think that's very significant. That's very important, because I think the world has changed since the Bretton Woods institutions were created in 1944. They were created in the US. The world has shifted. If you look at how the UN was composed post-World War II, they were around 45 to 50 countries. Lots of countries were still under colonialism, especially in Africa, especially in Asia, especially in Latin America. So their voices were somehow subdued back then. But enter 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s as well, all those countries freed themselves from Western-led colonial powers. So I think that's, we're sitting in 2025 now, that is the major difference. These guys from the developing world, from the global south, if you look at Asia, Latin America, Africa especially, 55 countries in total and counting, they want their voices to be heard, because things have radically changed. If you look at Africa alone, the population, we have this distinct advantage of being the youngest continent. And I attended a UNISA lecture by Professor Sachs in Pretoria yesterday, and he forecasted that Africa's young population by 2050 is going to, I think it's going to go towards the 2 billion mark, the younger proportion. So I think that is the greatest dividend, especially for a continent such as Africa. And I think that's why the focus needs to be on this, on us, especially as South Africa heads this G20.
So I imagine, Ronesh, that it helps that the last 4 presidencies of the G20 have been global south countries, countries starting from Indonesia, India, Brazil, then South Africa.
And South Africa, absolutely.
In terms of pursuing that agenda of sustainable development, right? Development that meets the needs of today's generations without jeopardizing future generations' ability to meet their own needs. How have we fared there in your assessment around issues such as climate, financing for climate adaptation and a just energy transition?
I think the biggest takeaway from the G20 under South Africa's presidency is going to be looking at issues such as that, because Western countries do not face the wrath, or most of the wrath, that's unleashed by climate change. It's mostly countries in Africa, it's mainly countries in Latin America and in Asia, and I think this is why it's so important that, you know, President Cyril Ramaphosa is placing the focus on issues such as that. You know, talking about African debt. African countries in total, the last time I checked, by 2024, African countries were owing China close to $90 billion. And if you talk about public debts, as far back as 2022, Africa public debt amounted to a whopping $1.8 trillion. This is US dollars. And there is a risk factor when it comes to Africa, because, you know, the Western countries, you know, I hate to say it, they don't trust Africa, because there is the possibility of, you know, not fulfilling their debt obligations. And that's why there is that perception that when there is that risk factor, then the bond yields for actually paying back the debt actually increases for Africa as compared to countries in the West. Absolutely. You know, compared to a country in the global north. You know, one example was Ivory Coast and Serbia. They almost share the same kind of metrics, but if you look at the bond yields for Ivory Coast to repay that debt, it's much, much higher for a country as small as Serbia.
Ronesh, let's leave it there for now. Just one of the many conversations we will have with Dr. Ronesh Dhawraj, who is SABC News research editor. Stay with us. You're watching SABC News. We are the host broadcaster of the G20 South Africa 2025. I'm back with more in just a moment.
SABC, host broadcaster of the G20 South Africa 2025.